Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and this is a full recap of Invincible Season 1, released in 2021. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. 3 years following the end of the Invincible comic book series, created by Robert Kirkman, Cory Walker, and Ryan Ottley, that spanned across 15 years and 144 issues, an Invincible animated series debuted on Amazon Prime Video, to much acclaim from fans and critics alike. So with it now having been 2 years since Season 1's release, we've decided to take a look back at everything that went down in the show's first 8 episodes. The season opens outside the White House on 2 security guards, whose ordinary days are soon interrupted by a sudden attack from the Mauler twins, who aren't actually twins, but rather an original and a clone of the mad scientist Mauler, who've come to threaten the safety of the president. But their attack is quickly interrupted by the arrival of the Guardians of the Globe, the Immortal, Darkwing, War Woman, Red Rush, Aquarius, Martian Man, and the Green Ghost, along with another superhero who's chosen not to become an official member of the team named Omni-Man. And together, the 8 heroes are able to swiftly take down the Maulers, who are then transported to prison by the Global Defense Agency, a multinational government organization in charge of protecting Earth. We then transition over to the home of the Grayson family to meet a young man named Mark and his mother Debbie, who it turns out are the wife and son of Omni-Man, Nolan Grayson. Mark, despite being the son of a superpowered warrior from the planet Viltrum, currently has no powers of his own, as they've yet to kick in, but that doesn't stop him from trying to be a hero at school after witnessing a kid named Todd harassing a girl named Amber Bennett. But his efforts just result in him being knocked on his ass, with Todd's assault only being stopped thanks to Amber kicking him in the nuts. Following school, Mark then heads over to his job at Burger Mart, where we later see him taking out the trash, and it's here where Mark's powers finally kick in. So he promptly fills his parents in on the news when he gets home, leaving his father frozen for a moment, before Nolan then offers to begin his training the following morning. Mark can't wait till then though, as while in bed, his mind jumps back to a memory from the day his father told him where he really came from, in which Nolan explains that millions of miles from here, out in deep space, is his home planet Viltrum. Whose people, Viltrumites, are very similar to humans, except they can fly, move at super speed, and possess great strength. The reason he'd come to Earth, though, was because he, like most other Viltrumites, had chosen to leave Viltrum to help lesser developed worlds such as Earth, for which he'd volunteered to act as its sole protector, later leading to him meeting Mark's mother and then making Mark, who with him being half Viltrumite, will also eventually develop powers of his own, including flight. Now, back in the present, Mark decides to hop out of bed and test if he really can finally fly, and that test turns out successful, although he doesn't quite have it down yet, particularly when it comes to landing. So, flight's the first thing he and his father focus on during training, before they then shift their focus onto combat training, and how to use their flight to their advantage in a fight, with Nolan having Mark repeatedly attempt to hit him before deciding to just show him how it's done and landing a huge strike into Mark's chest, leaving him gasping for air. And Nolan defends his actions by telling Mark he has to be prepared for anything. This has left Mark pretty upset though, primarily because he worries his father now believes he's too weak to do what he does. So he attempts to prove to himself that he can take the hits at school by allowing Todd to punch him in the face repeatedly, leading Todd, with his punches having almost no effect, to run away. And after school, Mark then throws on a homemade superhero costume and decides to try and fight crime on his own, soon encountering 3 robbers on the run from the police, including a man capable of encasing his body in rock known as Titan, who after a brief fight, Mark's able to shatter the rock form of and incapacitate. Following his victory, Mark's found by his father, who isn't too happy with the stunt he just pulled. So Mark, still wanting to prove he's strong enough to do this, urges his father to hit him again, but Nolan, realizing he's gone about Mark's training wrong thus far, instead hugs him before taking him to his tailor and close friend, Art Rosenbaum, who's created costumes for many of Earth's heroes.
Oh, that's bulletproof
shit. To begin the suit-making process, Art usually likes to go with their superhero name, which Mark hasn't picked out yet, but he eventually does decide on one the following day through some words of encouragement from his father during training.
Kids your age think they're invincible, and it holds them back, makes them careless. The thing is, you're different. You actually are invincible.
So Mark, now with his new suit and going by Invincible, once again heads out to fight some crime and encounters another supervillain called Kill Cannon, who he makes quick work of. Meanwhile, we see each of the Guardians of the Globe are suddenly called to meet at their headquarters for a Guardians emergency, but upon their arrival, they quickly realize that none of them had actually signaled the alert, and before they can understand what's going on, they're suddenly attacked by Omni-Man, who shockingly manages to catch Red Rush and crush his head, before then killing each of the other Guardians, despite them putting up a worthy fight that knocks him into a coma. Shortly following the massacre, the 8 superhumans are found by agents of the GDA, led by director Cecil Stedman and his assistant Donald Ferguson, who quickly transports them to the GDA's base, the Pentagon.
I still don't know why he
able
attacked
to patch up
them.
Omni-Man, but fail to revive the 7 dead heroes, before then bringing in Debbie and Mark to inform them of what went down, which Cecil doesn't actually know the exact details of yet, since whoever the attacker was left no trace of their identity. Meanwhile, downtown, there's another huge problem that requires the GDA's attention, as an army of interdimensional beings known as Flaxons have just arrived on Earth and have begun killing numerous civilians. So with Earth's strongest team of heroes now dead and Omni-Man incapacitated, Mark decides to try and take on the aliens himself, which proves to be much more traumatic and brutal than he'd expected, and leaves him frozen in a state of shock. But fortunately, he's soon joined in battle by another team of heroes known as the Teen Team, featuring Duplicate, Rexplode, Robot, and
Rexplode!
Even with their arrival though, the Flaxons still remain in control, and it appears they're actually about to kill the Teen Team until the aliens begin to suddenly age rapidly, which is a result of them coming from a dimension where time moves much faster, so they're forced to exit through their portal in order to avoid dying of old age. The day following the Flaxons' attack, Mark actually runs into Eve, full name Samantha Eve Wilkins, while at school, and after some talking, she invites him to meet with the rest of the team, and during this later meeting, we learn that Eve is actually dating Rex, despite him being a bit of a douche. A few days later, Mark is informed that his father has finally awoken from his coma, and shortly after that, Nolan's permitted to return home. Only a short week after that though, Cecil's already in need of his help once again, as they've discovered that a being Nolan's tangled with before is rapidly approaching Earth, so they need his help to stop it. But Debbie refuses to let him go back to work so soon, and instead, Mark offers to handle the job. So he's sent out into space to fend off the otherworldly being named Alan the Alien, who throughout their brawl communicates with Invincible through telepathy, and eventually pauses their fight upon realizing Mark has no idea who he is or why they're fighting. So Alan sits him down and explains that he's an evaluation officer for the Coalition of Planets, and that his job is to stop by planets and make sure there's someone capable of defending them against planet-conquering monsters. He's only supposed to go to planets that signed up for their program though, and it turns out Earth never did, and he'd just gotten them mixed up with another planet called Urath all this time. So upon realizing this, he heads back to the Coalition of Planets, hoping that he doesn't get fired. Moving ahead to the next day while Mark's at school, as the good news keeps on coming, while he's approached in the halls by Todd, who, having been blackmailed by Amber using some photos of him he'd like to keep hidden, apologizes to Mark and hands him Amber's number. But unfortunately, Mark's then promptly informed of some bad news, as the Flaxons have returned to Earth, and according to Robot, they've now rendered themselves immune to Earth's time stream. So he proposes they contact Cecil to suggest a nuclear response, but Invincible and Eve refuse to nuke everyone in the city, and choose to instead fight a losing battle. Fortunately though, as each of them are being pummeled by Flaxons, the battle is flipped completely in Earth's favor thanks to the arrival of Omni-Man, who unleashes a brutal attack on the aliens that sends them running back through their portal. But he doesn't just stop there, as he then follows them back to their dimension to completely decimate every corner of it.
You don't seem to understand. Earth isn't yours to conquer.
Shortly following Nolan's return to Earth, the news of the Guardian's death finally breaks, leading to public and private funeral ceremonies for the heroes. And at the latter, Cecil approaches Robot with an offer to build and lead the new Guardians of the Globe, which he accepts. So Robot calls in a bunch of lesser-known heroes to begin tryouts for the team, which Invincible, although attending, will not be taking part in, since his father wants to train him himself. And when the tryouts are complete, Adam Eve, Rexplode, Duplicate, Shrinking Ray, Monster Girl, who's actually a 24-year-old with powers accompanied by a curse that makes her younger every time she transforms, and a former Guardians member who'd lost his powers some time ago named Black Samson, are chosen to join the new team. Eve immediately resigns though, refusing to be on the same and choose to instead bad news, as the Flaxons have returned to Earth, and according to Robot, they've now rendered themselves immune to Earth's time stream. So he proposes they contact Cecil to suggest a nuclear response, but Invincible and Eve refuse to nuke everyone in the city and choose to instead fight a losing battle. Fortunately though, as each of them are being pummeled by Flaxons, the battle is flipped completely in Earth's favor thanks to the arrival of Omni-Man, who unleashes a brutal attack on the aliens that sends them running back through their portal. But he doesn't just stop there, as he then follows them back to their dimension to completely decimate every corner of it.
You don't seem to understand.
Earth is not yours to conquer.
Shortly following Nolan's return to Earth, the news of the Guardian's death finally breaks, leading to public and private funeral ceremonies for the heroes. And at the latter, Cecil approaches Robot with an offer to build and lead the new Guardians of the Globe, which he accepts. So Robot calls in a bunch of lesser-known heroes to begin tryouts for the team, which Invincible, although attending, will not be taking part in, since his father wants to train him himself. And when the tryouts are complete, Adam Eve, Rexplode, Duplicate, Shrinking Ray, Monster Girl, who's actually a 24-year-old with powers accompanied by a curse that makes her younger every time she transforms, and a former Guardians member who lost his powers some time ago named Black Samson, are chosen to join the new team. Eve immediately resigns though, refusing to be on the same team as Rex and Kate, since a few days ago, she'd actually walked in on Rex cheating on her with Kate and her duplicates. Moving ahead a bit now to Mark's first hangout with Amber, who he decided to call up previously, and the two agreed on a study date at his home. But just when she gets there, he's suddenly met by Cecil teleporting into his room, as he needs his help in taking down a rogue supervillain named Doc Seismic, who's begun wreaking havoc on Mount Rushmore using earthquake wristbands he'd created. So Mark leaves Amber alone in his room for a while, claiming he has to help his dad's friend with something, to deal with Seismic alongside Eve. And once having done that, he then returns to a disgruntled Amber, with whom he's quickly able to smooth things over, and the two even start making out. Elsewhere, Rex is shown also trying to smooth things over with Eve, by using his abilities to put on a fireworks show for her. But she still decides they should go their separate ways, and actually heads over to Mark's house afterwards, as the two had grown close recently. But she doesn't end up getting the chance to talk to him, since he's still busy with Amber. Shifting focus back to the death of the Guardians now, as we see Debbie, while doing some work late at night, being met in her home by the demon detective, Damian Darkblood, who we were first introduced to earlier when he arrived at the scene of the Guardian's death to begin looking into the case, as he must seek justice for others in order to save his own soul, and avoid returning to hell. And after looking into all the evidence at his order of the Guardian's death, to begin looking into the case, as he must seek justice for others in order to save his own soul, and avoid returning to hell. And after looking into all the evidence at his disposal, he suggested to Cecil that Omni-Man was behind the murders, but Cecil chose not to believe him and ordered him not to tell anyone else about his theory. Darkblood, though, has now come to meet with Debbie in hopes that she'll know something about what took place, but their conversation is quickly interrupted by Nolan entering the room, so the demon's forced to exit. Nolan knows he'd been there though, and later confronts Darkblood at his office to suggest that he was the one behind the Guardian's murders, but they both know it was Nolan, and Darkblood claims the truth will come out eventually. When Nolan returns home, he and Debbie get into a brief argument about how strange he's been acting, before the two are then interrupted by the arrival of Cecil, who's come to ask if Nolan would be willing to shadow NASA's first manned mission to Mars and make sure nothing goes wrong. But Nolan declines the offer, and it's instead accepted by Mark. So Mark travels to Mars alongside NASA's aircraft and manages to remain hidden the entire trip. But although everything goes smoothly at first, shortly after landing, Mark ends up falling asleep and wakes up to find that the 4 astronauts have gone missing. After following the trail of their footsteps though, he manages to find a trapdoor leading to tunnels underground, out from which he's suddenly attacked by a sequid that fortunately doesn't do him any harm, before he then stumbles upon a group of Martians who, just like Martian Man, have shape-changing abilities. After seeing a sequid try and fail to attack Invincible, they reveal that the sequids are actually world-destroying parasitic aliens, seeking to take over an appropriate host to become unified and unstoppable. They've been unable to take over any of the Martians though, thanks to their shape-changing abilities, but they could successfully take over a human. So the Martian Emperor orders for the 4 astronauts to be executed. Mark obviously can't let that happen, so he grabs hold of the astronauts and flies them back to their ship, on which they eventually manage to escape. But it turns out one of the astronauts had already been taken over and replaced by a sequid, as immediately following their exit, the possessed astronaut unleashes a wave of sequids onto the Martians. Throughout all this the possessed astronaut had already been taken over and replaced by a sequid, as immediately following their exit, the possessed astronaut unleashes a wave of sequids onto the Martians. Throughout all this back on Earth, Nolan, in an attempt to make amends with Debbie, decides to take her on a trip to Italy for the 2 weeks Mark's gone. And while they're gone, Damian Darkblood takes the opportunity to look throughout the house. As he's searching though, he's interrupted by Cecil and multiple GDA agents, who'd actually been put on Darkblood's trail by Nolan. Nolan's claims that Darkblood had committed the murders is also backed up by them having found dried blood of the Guardians at his office. But Cecil is actually aware that Nolan had planted that evidence, and has actually brought Darkblood to the Pentagon to deal out punishment for him not dropping the case like he told him to, since he needs to keep their knowledge of Nolan's involvement hidden until they can figure out how to stop him. So Cecil lures him into an exorcism and uses the Demonius Ex Mortem to send him back to hell. When Mark returns to Earth following the Mars mission, he begins really struggling to juggle his responsibilities as a superhero and his growing relationship with Amber, with him consistently either missing or showing up late to their plans. So he looks to make it up to her by joining her at the Beckwell Community Center to volunteer. A few days prior to that though, Mark, while flying over the city, has his attention drawn by the previously defeated Titan, who now is hoping to actually gain Invincible's help in taking down his boss, Machine Head, who Titan's been forced to work for as a button man under the threat of his wife and daughter's lives. Mark's hesitant to help him at first, unsure if he's really trustworthy. But after seeing him with his family, he agrees to do it. So prior to Mark's plans at the community center, he and Titan break into Machine Head's penthouse to apprehend him. But it turns out, Machine Head had known they were coming, and so hired 5 supervillains, Battle Beast, Kursk, Megmaniac, Tether Tyrant, and Furnace, to thwart their attempt and kill them. And the supervillains quickly gain the upper hand in their brawl, primarily thanks to Battle Beast, who delivers quite the beating to Invincible before being interrupted by the new Guardians of the Globe. Although the Guardians haven't yet figured out how to really work together as a team, so the villains still maintain control despite their arrival, with Battle Beast continuing to beat Invincible to the brink of death, as well as nearly kill Black Samson and Monster Girl. But seeing their teammates severely wounded actually helps the Guardians start fighting as one, and they manage to take out each of the villains outside of Battle Beast, who decides to leave on his own accord, embarrassed by the other supervillains' performances. Machine Head attempts to leave as well, with help from his right-hand man, Isotope, who's capable of teleporting himself and others, but he's currently nowhere to be found. So Rex is able to knock Machine Head out and have him arrested upon the GDA's arrival, who also rush Invincible, Black Samson, and Monster Girl to their hospital in hopes of saving them. Once everyone's exited the building, Isotope then re-enters alongside Titan, who it turns out was just using Invincible so he could take the brunt of Machine Head's attack prior to his arrest. And Titan now looks to take the latter's place as the city's new kingpin. Back at the Pentagon though, the doctors are fortunately able to revive the heroes, with Black Samson, after being defibrillated, shockingly not only regaining a heartbeat, but also his superhuman abilities, and Monster Girl making a full recovery thanks to help from Robot, who appears to have taken a keen interest in her. Mark also eventually returns to 100%, and after convincing Amber his injuries were from being hit by a bus, he looks for them to start things fresh, beginning with taking a trip to Upstate University along with Mark's best friend William, per an invitation from William's crush, Rick. And this seems to work in improving their relationship, with the two even making plans of attending Upstate U together once they finish high school. But soon enough, things take a turn for the worse when a cyborg suddenly comes bursting out of the ground and begins wreaking havoc on the campus, forcing Mark to suit up as Invincible to stop it. The creature ends up taking itself out though, after its helmet gets knocked off and it sees its own face, which prompts it to leap straight onto a pointed statue. Also during the short battle, William managed to deduce that Mark is actually invincible, while on the other hand, Amber grows furious with Mark for seemingly leaving them during the attack, and she refuses to speak to him for the rest of the trip. He isn't able to dwell on that for very long though, as later that night, Rick and William end up getting kidnapped by another cyborg, so he heads out to find them and eventually does within the sewers, as William's just about to be operated on by another attendee of Upstate U, Genius D.A. Sinclair, who believes he's fixing humanity's weaknesses by transforming them into cyborgs, 3 of which he sends after Invincible, with one of them being Rick. But their attack doesn't go on for too long, as William eventually manages to help Rick remember who he is, leading him to join Invincible's side of the fight to rid the other 2 cyborgs of Sinclair's control, before Invincible then breaks Sinclair's jaw and calls in Cecil to lock him up. The following morning, Mark, William, and Amber drive back home, while Amber still refuses to talk to Mark. So to explain why he's been such a bad boyfriend, he finally reveals to her that he's invincible. But it turns out she already knew he was a superhero and is still upset that he makes her feel unimportant, resulting in the two breaking up. During Mark's trip to upstate U, meanwhile, Debbie, while looking throughout her closet, had stumbled upon Damien Darkblood's notepad, which he'd purposely left for her to find before being taken away by Cecil earlier. And within it, she found intriguing notes about Nolan's costume that had been damaged during the Guardians' attack. So she began searching throughout the house for it and eventually found it, still covered in blood. And upon finding it, she then took it to Art Rosenbaum so he could look over it from top to bottom. And his examination proves once and for all that Nolan killed the Guardians. So with it now having been proven to her that Nolan was the one behind the murders all along, she confronts him to try and learn why. And he claims he had no other choice and that she just needs to trust him, but she instead demands he leaves. Immediately following his exit, Donald Ferguson and other GDA agents arrive at the home and hastily take her back to their base, where Cecil explains that he's known Nolan killed the Guardians and has tried and failed to look for a way to defeat him. So he believes now that their only hope at standing a chance against Omni-Man is Invincible. Just in case that doesn't work out either though, Cecil also calls for the Guardians to meet at their headquarters and await further instructions. Since their battle against Machine Head's team of supervillains previously, the Guardians have actually started to get along really well, with Robot and Monster Girl in particular becoming very close. Although it seems Robot has hopes that they can become even closer. It turns out Robot isn't actually just a robot, but rather a drone controlled remotely by a severely deformed scientist named Rudolph Connors, who decided years ago to keep his real identity and appearance hidden by becoming Robot and acting as closely to an actual AI as possible. But now, having met Monster Girl, who like him is also a prisoner in her own body, he's decided to create a new body of his own. In order to do this though, he'd need help from the Maulers, who as we know are experts in tissue growth and DNA replication. So he helps break them out of prison and offers to pay them to build him a new body, to which they agree. For this body, Robot covertly takes a sample of Rex's DNA, since he's noticed that Monster Girl's shown some interest in him. And eventually, his new body is complete, so the Maulers then take Rudy out of his pod and successfully copy his consciousness into his new body. After which, the original Rudy then asks his new self to put him out of his misery, and so he does. With their job complete, and after handing over their payment, Rudy tells the Maulers it's time to go back to prison, which they refuse of course, so Rudy, using a neural link that he had the Maulers install, is forced to unleash a giant robot attack onto them. Although that's quickly interrupted when he's called away to Guardians HQ, where he then introduces himself to the team and explains how he got to this point, freaking pretty much all of them out, especially Rex, but it does seem to have gained Monster Girl's affection. Shifting back to Omni-Man now as he returns home, hoping to be the first to explain all that's happened to Mark, but he's instead met by a bunch of GDA agents, who he makes quick work of before noticing Donald and even more GDA agents spying on him across the street. So he enters the building and goes after Donald, forcing the latter to sacrifice himself and set off a bomb in hopes of taking Nolan out of commission for a bit. But the bombing ends up having no effect on him, and he heads off to search for Mark, who's currently busy venting with Eve about everything that went down with Amber, while she also vents about some personal problems of her own. Following her breakup with Rex, Eve had also had a falling out with her parents, with her father claiming that the worst day of his life was when she got her powers. So she decided to leave home and began solely focusing on helping those in need around the world. With Omni-Man fast approaching Mark and Eve, Cecil's next option is to unleash an attack via satellite onto him. But this fails as he just flies straight to the device to destroy it. So he then sends down another attack using 3 cyborgs he had D.A. Sinclair create for him using dead US soldiers called Reanimen. But although they put up a good fight, Nolan again ultimately comes out on top. With neither of those attacks working, Cecil unleashes the final option at his disposal, that being a gigantic kaiju creature Omni-Man had defeated previously, which they've now pumped with every drug, enhancement, and upgrade they have, and have named Hail Mary. And this beast actually holds the control against Nolan. Mark and Eve, though, after hearing the destruction from afar, decide to make their way over and offer help, although Eve soon receives a phone call from Cecil filling her in on everything, and is told to just head over to Guardians HQ, so she does, while Mark's already rushed into battle to help his father. Things are soon made even more difficult for Nolan though, as back at the Maulers' base, we see that they've dug up Immortal's body, as they plan on reviving him under their control to get revenge on Rudy. But although they do succeed in reviving him, their mind control doesn't work, and the Immortal instead rushes off to find Omni-Man. And upon finding him, Immortal unleashes a relentless attack, leaving Invincible to fight off Hail Mary alone, but he's fortunately able to take it down using an electric cable, just in time to witness his father murder Immortal once again by slicing him in half. Mark initially thinks someone's controlling Nolan, but it's quickly revealed that's not the case, as Nolan explains the truth about his home planet Viltrum. He reveals that Viltrum have created a perfect civilization through years of removing the weak from their society and cutting their population in half to reach their full potential. And once they had become the greatest empire in the galaxy, perfect civilization through years of removing the weak from their society and cutting their population in half to reach their full potential. And once they had become the greatest empire in the galaxy, they decided to become the only empire in the galaxy. So they traveled and unleashed their power onto thousands of planets until they either accepted their place in the Viltrum Empire or were destroyed. But as their territory grew, their forces were stretched thin. So to more efficiently conquer worlds, each of their most trusted officers were sent to weaken a planet by themselves, and Nolan was sent to Earth, which now that Mark's gotten his powers, it's time to welcome into the Viltrum Empire as well. Mark can't understand how his father could do this to all their friends and family, specifically his mother, but Nolan explains that, although he does love Debbie, she's more like a pet to him, and this statement completely sets Mark off. So with Mark refusing to help conquer Earth, Nolan's forced to unleash a brutal attack onto him, during which he sends him crashing into the city, resulting in a ton of death, and Nolan plans to continue killing people until Mark accepts the inevitable, next slamming him down into the subway and forcing him to watch as he uses his body to kill an entire train of civilians. Even after all this, in a continued vicious assault by his father, Mark still refuses to let him take over his home, so Nolan begins punching him over and over to death, while claiming he can always just start over with another kid. Before he can land the fatal blow though, Nolan's mind flashes back to a memory from when he and Debbie were watching a young Mark play baseball, which Nolan claimed was a waste of time, but Debbie helped him recognize the joy it brought Mark. That's harder to feel as you get older, and the weight of the world bogs you down.
Our children remind us of the joys in life. It brings us back, shows us what life is all about.
And Nolan, after seeing the smile on Mark's face, began cheering him on as well. The memory ultimately makes Nolan unable to actually kill his son, and instead he berates him for fighting a pointless battle. As 500 years from now, everyone and everything he loves or cares about will be gone. But Mark claims he'd at least still have his father, which appears to break Nolan down, and he promptly flies out of Earth. Following his departure, a GDA helicopter arrives to pick up Mark and take him to the Pentagon to be nursed back to health, while the Guardians head off to save as many people as they can from Omni-Man's destruction. Also throughout this, the Maulers are found at their base by GDA agents and are subsequently transported back to prison. Mark spends the next few weeks recovering until he's back to 100% and able to return home, where he's soon met by William, Eve, and Amber, the latter of whom greets him with a kiss, leading to the two getting back together. But the group's conversation is eventually interrupted when Mark receives a call from Cecil informing him that someone's flying towards Earth from deep space. So Mark flies off to face them, and it turns out to be Alan the alien, here to warn Mark that there's a Viltrumite on his planet, which he already knows of course. So he explains to Alan everything that happened with his father, which in turn leads Alan to reveal that the Viltrum Empire had also destroyed his planet, which is why he joined the Coalition of Planets, as they're trying to unite enough worlds to stop the Viltrumites. So Mark offers to help them however he can, but until then, he has plenty of enemies to deal with on Earth, as the season ends with a montage of Earth's various supervillains. And that was our recap of Invincible Season 1. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful in any way, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also let us know in the comments below how you'd rank each episode of Invincible so far. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you.
Yo.
After waiting what feels like absolutely ages for Season 2 of Invincible to come out, it's finally arrived back on our screens. Following on from the events of the finale of Season 1, 1 month after Omni-Man destroyed the city and was on the cusp of killing his son, this season has gone into the multiverse, and it's safe to say that this one is going to get really
The multiverse. Oh no. Again? Alright. Last vid, and I probably gotta go.
Really interesting. With Angstrom Levy being introduced to us, the Maul is being released from captivity, and Mark struggling to deal with the possibility that he could eventually turn into his father. Let's recap, break down, and explain all that there was to take away from this first episode. So let's get into it. Here is a breakdown of Invincible Season 2 Episode 1. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The opening sequence. This first episode opened up with a scene that was pretty epic, to be honest. It was a scene where it seemed as though Mark had teamed up with his father in taking over planet Earth with the hopes of recruiting it as part of the Viltrum Empire, something which was completely different to the Season 1 finale. They were quite literally tearing through the city and destroying everything and anything that was in their path. For me, the most brutal moment was when Invincible crushed Eve to the point where she was paralyzed, deliberately not killing her so that he could visit her in the future and keep her there. It marked a real change in the character, and it was a horrific moment to watch, and it showed just how scary and brutal Mark was in that moment. Within this scene, we saw that an individual called Angstrom was there, and he was part of the resistance against Omni-Man and Invincible. He was on the cusp of being killed, and he was part of the... Within this scene, we saw that an individual called Angstrom was there, and he was part of the resistance against Omni-Man and Invincible. He was on the cusp of being killed by them before we saw him go through a small green portal, something which at the time made no sense at all. But it was later on in the episode where it started to come together. Angstrom has the ability to be able to travel through portals into different dimensions, an infinite number, and he has access to all of them. Within the dimensions, there are small differences that occur in each of them which lead to the differentiation, and in the opening sequence, we weren't in the dimension that we were familiar with. It was in fact a dimension where Mark made the decision to side with his father in taking over Earth, hence why things looked so different, and why when Invincible flew off, the world seemed back to normal, because our return was when he was looking at the cliff edge where he was pummeled by his father in the season finale. The whole multiverse, separate dimension story arc looks as though it's going to be something that's going to be a key focus in this season of the show, as Angstrom looks to acquire this knowledge of the dimensions and make key differences, but one where he also
This video's
going to
contain
contain
spoilers.
Invincible for wiping out every version of himself from the infinite amount of dimensions that exist. It feels like we could see this meme being played out, but with Invincible, and it's a moment that I'll happily wait for. Mark's biggest fear. This episode really showed us the fear that's within Mark, nothing that's external, but internal. The very thought of him becoming his father is something that's damaging his mind and his well-being. We saw this prominent throughout a number of different moments. When he was speaking with Eve, when the Immortal said that he didn't trust him, when Cecil was talking about how he once let Omni-Man back in the game too soon and how he didn't want to do it to him, when he was speaking with Amber in the bedroom, and also when he looked down at his hands and saw the sheer amount of blood and death that was caused with him trying to shut down the somatic encoder. This is something that I feel will definitely be in his mind for the duration of the season, as it will most likely be his biggest weakness, his own mind. And I think if and when he confronts his father, it'll be a make or break moment for the character. He's mourning his father and the life that he had with him, but he has a deep resentment and hatred for him because of what he did to him and also his mother, and the lies that were present. He even took 3 plates out of the cupboard for dinner, so he's still not fully processed everything. So it's going to be a real complex, personal, and intimate issue that we're going to be watching unfold.
Oh fuck, I didn't
Will
realize
most
that.
likely be ingrained in most of the actions that Mark carries out. We saw it in this episode where he was making lackluster attempts at saving the day, avoiding conflict because he was having flashbacks, and also freezing on the spot. So it's something that I'm looking forward to seeing more of, as it allows us to dig deeper inside of the character of Mark. Who is Angstrom Levy? Angstrom Levy was introduced... After waiting what feels like absolutely Angstrom Levy was introduced to us in this first episode, and he was a real interesting character. In the episode, we saw the version of him from the dimension that we were familiar with, and how he originally had good intentions. Angstrom has the ability to be able to access the infinite dimensions that exist in the multiverse. One where the same individuals live, but different parts of their lives or the world are ever so slightly adjusted. For example, there was one where Mark made the decision to side with his father and destroy the city, and there were many others where there would be cures to certain illnesses. What Angstrom planned on doing was combining all of the knowledge from every version of himself in the other dimensions, putting it inside of his head with the Mauler's somatic encoder, and then making a change to the world and providing the cures that were needed, or solving the issues that were present. So as all good villains start out, he originally wanted to do good. However, due to Invincible breaking into the warehouse when the procedure was taking place and trying to stop it from happening at the orders of Cecil, this was whilst Angstrom was hooked up to the 1000 minds and acquiring all of the knowledge from the other dimensions. The Maulers were ultimately summoned with the intention of stopping Invincible, but they weren't holding back and were going to kill him. This was something that didn't sit right with Angstrom, and he didn't want his utopia built with blood and the death of an individual on his hands. So he took off the helmet during the procedure, something which he was warned not to do. And ultimately, it led to mass devastation and all of the Angstroms being killed, and all of the Maulers except for one which was deformed. With one Angstrom awakening and looking like he had slight deformities too, such as his brain being humongous and being merged with his body due to the explosion that occurred and the fusion that took place. We saw that he was mad with Invincible for being responsible for it. Angstrom needed to remember that he was himself and not the multiple other versions of himself due to the knowledge that he acquired. But it seemed as though that was something that wasn't necessarily the case, as he was in a delirious, confused state and mixing up what actually happened. He may have been thinking of Invincible from an alternate dimension where he was actually causing mass devastation. So with him swearing to seek revenge on Invincible, Invincible is going to be facing the wrath of Angstrom in this season of the show. He teleported off at the end, so we know he still has his abilities. Overall review. I thought this was a really good way to kickstart the second season of the show. It had many good moments in it, such as seeing Giant and also the Guardians of the Globe trying to defeat.
No.
In about 6 hours, the second episode of Invincible Season 2 has so much character development and setup that it may require 2 viewings to fully appreciate it. Alternatively, you may watch Invincible Episode 2 once and then watch through our comprehensive summary to see everything we covered in this episode. When new episodes of Invincible Season 2 air on Thursdays, be sure to tune into our recap videos as well. We'll be discussing the most talked about scenes and offering our predictions for what could happen next. Graduation Day. The episode begins with what many other series would have considered to be the show's climax. Mark Grayson and his pals receive their high school diplomas. As the dean addresses the graduating class, Invincible engages in combat with his longtime adversary Doc Seismic. After getting lost in Season 1, Seismic found a race of lava monsters dwelling close to the Earth's core. Seismic is back, this time with his sinister plans to destroy the Lincoln Memorial as part of his environmental terrorism. He is stopped by Invincible, but not before the monument sustains major damage. Cecil believes that Mark still has a lot to learn. Mark returns in time to see the last moments of his own school graduation, but his excitement causes him to fling his cap too high. Title screen. The speech ends with the students being given the advice to be invincible, which is a traditional transition into the title screen, which features a second crack forming in the backdrop wall. Graduation Day hangover. Mark, his best friend William, fiancée Amber, and Adam Eve meet for a few post-graduation beers and talk about the future. While Eve is working to restore Chicago, William is going to relax, and Amber is interested in activism. Mark is unwavering in his commitment to Cecil and the GDA. Russ Livingston, the astronaut from Martians Among Us, is a Martian who returns. Adam Eve meet for a few post-graduation day hangover. Mark, his best friend William, fiancée Amber, and Adam Eve meet for a few post-graduation
fiancé!
Seismic is back, this time with his sinister plans to destroy the Lincoln Memorial as part of his environmental terrorism. He is stopped by Invincible, but not before the monument sustains major damage. Cecil believes that Mark still has a lot to learn. Mark returns in time to see the last moments of his own school graduation, but his excitement causes him to fling his cap too high. Title screen. The speech ends with the students being given the advice to be invincible, which is a traditional transition into the title screen, which features a second crack forming in the backdrop wall. graduation day hangover. Mark, his best friend William, fiancée Amber, and Adam Eve meet for a few post-graduation beers and talk about the future. While Eve is working to restore Chicago, William is going to relax, and Amber is interested in activism. Mark is unwavering in his commitment to Cecil and the GDA. Russ Livingston, the astronaut from Martians Among Us, is a Martian who returned unexpectedly from the Mars episode of Season 1 by changing into a human. But he's having trouble adjusting. Russ's NASA boss begins to inform him that he is being placed on involuntary leave. Nevertheless, the Martian, not knowing Earth culture, feels this may be the difference between life and death. Atomic Community Service Eve is using her abilities to reconstruct Chicago. Conflict arises between her rebuilding efforts and the local construction workers, who wonder if the work is up to code. A mother and her daughter support Eve's actions to make the neighborhood better. Eve goes above and above, transforming an empty lot into an opulent playground, all before receiving a call from her parents. Mommy issues. Mark and Debbie are still raw about Nolan's treachery, with Debbie unhappy at a loose counter door, mended following Omni-Man's confrontation with GDA soldiers in the house. Recognizing their mutual suffering, Debbie tries to arrange a beach vacation for Mark's graduation, but he's actually spending time with Cecil. They fight about whether Mark has to be invincible thus much or whether he can still be simply an innocent boy. Debbie's attempt to convince Mark that he has nothing to prove in comparison to Omni-Man simply enrages him. Cecil uses a mission assignment to end their heart-to-heart conversation. Guardians in training. Rex is tired of the Immortal putting a lot of training pressure on the Guardians of the Globe. Rex discovers that the Immortal is now in command of that as well as he tries to link up with Duplicate once more. Confusing. Russ problems. Russ Livingston is depicted as leading a really dull and scruffy existence in a cheap flat while consuming raw frozen pizzas. Russ receives an eviction notice from his landlord. But after watching a TV program about the Guardians of the Globe and their downfall, he feels inspired to become a superhero. Visiting the dark side. Mark's next task is to look into a haunted area where reports of Darkwing sightings have occurred. Mark battles a doppelganger of Darkwing who is actually the insane former sidekick of Darkwing, Nightboy, in order to protect the world from the threat of another renegade Viltrumite. He takes Mark into his cloak-style night realm and traps him. But Invincible terrifies him by claiming to be Omni-Man's son and winning the psychological battle. Elsewhere, Debbie ambushes Cecil, overtaking Mark's childhood by pushing him into superhero service, and it breaks down into a brawl about whether Cecil genuinely trusts Mark. Mark won't be sent on any risky assignments, Cecil swears. Debbie is shocked to see Donald deliver Cecil a file because she witnessed Cecil struggle and die. Donald notices something is strange as Cecil escorts Debbie away, despite Cecil's best efforts to ignore it. Envy Atomic. Adam, when Eve gets home, her foster parents, her dad works at a fast food restaurant, disclose that they are struggling financially. Eve makes an effort to assist by producing a variety of valuable items they may sell. When her father declines to accept the assistance, Eve accuses him of being overly arrogant and leaves a golden apple for them. Cross-country lunch date. Mark chooses to surprise Amber with lunch in the Paris casino in Las Vegas, perched atop the Eiffel Tower, after noticing her working on political issues. Mark regrets not taking her to the actual Paris since the speed of the jet would have caused her skin to peel off. When Cecil contacts Mark on yet another errand, the lunch goes horribly wrong. While Amber acknowledges this, she cautions Mark not to allow the voice in his ear be the only one he hears. Invincible of Atlantis, Cecil summons Mark to pay the hero Aquarius, who is slain by Omni-Man, a debt. As Mark and the Queen are married, he finds that the Atlanteans are more interested in love than in battle. Mark attempts to say no by being monogamous, but Cecil forces him to do so. Lizard League vs. Guardians. Cecil must contend with B-list antagonists he grudgingly sends in the Guardians to protect the Lizard League while the Atlantis operation is underway. The group spots an imposter of Rex battling the Lizard League, but it turns out to be Russ, who is now going undercover as the shape-shifting superhero the Shapesmith. He gets help from the Guardians to take care of the bad guys. Undersea Challenge. Mark humiliates herself by attempting to tell the Atlantean Queen that he has a girlfriend. The Queen responds by telling him that she is not seeking a new king. Even though she governed the island for 10 years while Aquarius was a superhero, she is irritated that he believed them to be so primitive and old-fashioned. But then she reveals that it's really a trial by fight with a gigantic Kraken monster. Give up. Domestic problems. Debbie attempts to re-enter the real estate market with Paul, her broker buddy. When Debbie remarks that the wife is not a pet and nearly incites a fight, the first couple they show the house to has an angry husband. Paul sends her home after determining that she isn't mentally stable enough to work at this point. Monster mayhem. Mark faces up against the Kraken, but it is stronger than he is and uses a sonic blast that damages Mark. To assist Mark escape, Cecil and the GDA try to use torpedoes as cover, but the monster's bonds are broken by the explosions, and it begins to rampage against Atlantis. In an attempt to show he is not his father, Mark defies an order to leave. He drives the Kraken into the ocean's depths, but he too is pulled below. Eventually, bruised but triumphant, Mark appears on a beach full of joyful holidaymakers. At the GDA, Cecil chastises Mark but acknowledges that the conflict with Atlantis was resolved when he saved the Queen. He gives Donald the command to record the sea monster's cry in order to potentially use it as a weapon against Viltrumites. Cecil ducks the topic when Donald asks how Debbie felt about him. Adam. Superhero wake-up call in the trash. Eve discovers the jewels she crafted for her parents. When she attempts to lecture her father about not becoming a poisonous man, her father ends up teaching her instead. According to a news report, Eve and her mother, who built the opulent park, were hurt when it collapsed, because Eve disregarded some elements with her abilities, such as the ground foundation's instability and code violations. The project was never finished. The lesson is that having power may lead to individuals acting against their better judgment. Debbie feels sad. When the kitchen cabinet at the Grayson residence finally gives up, Debbie loses it and completely ruins the kitchen. When Mark discovers her crying on the ground, he attempts to console her, but she first rejects his efforts. As the Shapesmith, Russ, the new Guardian, is given a tour of Guardian's headquarters, but a montage of real-life incidents serves as a reminder that the Martian parasites known as sequids are still out there in the galaxy, and are drawing nearer to Earth. Angstrom lurking. In a scene from the end credits, Angstrom Levy, played by Sterling K. Brown, pays a visit to a Mark variation, who tells how his Earth defeated Invincible and Omni-Man. Levy leaves the Invincible version to face punishment after obtaining the information, then departs into the universe once more. Thanks for watching, and if you're new to channel, subscribe and click the bell, so you don't miss out latest videos of Media Breakdown.
Interesting.